Over 30,000 Dutch farmers have risen up in protest against their government in the wake of new limits that require farmers to radically curb their nitrogen emissions by up to 70% in the next 8 years. Smaller family-owned farms say that the new regulations, which limit livestock output and restrict some nitrogen-based fertilizers, are crippling to their businesses and could lead to some farms being shuttered.
Kim Iverson recently talked about this subject for one of her radars, and our next guest is here to expand. He writes of the protests in Newsweek, quote, "Whether it's truckers in Canada, farmers in the Netherlands, or oil and gas companies in the United States, ideology, not science or hard evidence, is dominating the agenda, gratifying the elites while immiserating the working class." Political scientist at Webster University Vienna, Ralph Schoellhammer, joins us now to expand on his analysis. Welcome to Rising, and apologies for not looking up how to pronounce your name before I introduced you, but we're so glad to have you here.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, please tell us more about what you wrote for Newsweek, maybe commissioned by my co-host Bacha over here. Talk to us about this uprising taking place.
Absolutely. So look at it, there are four groups that are decisive here. So one is the group of the activists, particularly environmental activists, who I think sincerely believe that the global apocalypse is imminent. So, and this group is, of course, very heavily represented in media and academia. Then you have a second group, which is the government, right? And that's the group that kind of they like to virtue signal to the first group. Then you have the third group, which are the companies who like to make business of these developments. And then you have the fourth group, which would be the people, as I described them, as middle and lower class, but I think you could also say those are the people that don't have a Twitter account, so to speak. And the first three groups, like the activists, the government, and the companies, they're like a Bermuda Triangle in which the fourth group get lost. And what happened in the Netherlands, it's absolutely fascinating. So the government made a promise to reduce nitrogen and methane. So, but they had a very long time frame. So like politicians do, right? They said, oh, we're gonna do this in the future. So who cares what we're gonna do in the future? But then these activists in the first group, they went to the courts. And then the courts told the government, listen, you have to do what you promised. And now, of course, the government is forced kind of to implement these policies that I suspect they never really expected that they have to do in the first place. And if I can put this a little bit on a broader perspective, because the piece really talks about a global uprising. Now, let us switch real quick just for a second to Sri Lanka. Right, there you have a very similar development. Right? Sri Lanka, for example, about 3 years ago, they banned artificial fertilizers, right? They went all into organic farming. And they did so because the government was told, kind of particularly also by Western consultants, again, that would be the companies group, right, the corporate interest, that if you do this, right, you can ingrain yourself with Western governments, this is gonna come across as very, very positive. But what happened is that within a very short amount of time, food production in Sri Lanka collapsed. So you have a similar situation in the Netherlands and in Sri Lanka, where kind of you have activists on the one hand, you have governments on the other hand, and corporations, again, as the third party, that kind of really squeezing, as I said before, right? We can call it the working class, we can call it, people who don't spend a lot of time in activism and social media. It's your pick, but that is kind of what's happening. And I think this is something that's going to spread beyond Sri Lanka, beyond the Netherlands. And if you allow me one last comment, you saw this a little bit in 2016 in the United States, right? I still believe that despite all the many interpretations, the election of Donald Trump was exactly this, right? Those were people that were not happy with with academia and media. They were not happy with the regular, the run-of-the-mill politicians, and they felt screwed over by large companies, or as they very often termed it, globalization. And I think this is something we just see getting now even more force than it did before.
You laid that out so well about the four groups. I think that applies to so many different contexts. When you read the media coming out of the Netherlands, it's a lot like the media that came out of the United States in 2016, a lot like the media coverage of the truckers' convoy earlier this year in Canada. They cast these uprising as extremists. Are they extremists, Professor Schoellhammer?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, I wouldn't call them extremists in a sense. They are probably sometimes extreme in the way that they voice their opinion. But this is a problem that I would say is almost a little bit inherent to democracy. I would argue that the people at the moment, and I think this is particularly true in the Western world at the moment, they have a sense that something is not going right? They have a sense that they're dissatisfied with the system. I think Gallup recently did a poll, trust in political institutions is at the lowest low. So they have a sense that something is wrong. They just can't articulate it well. In a sense, forgive me, I don't want to beat that horse into the ground, but again, that's very similar to Donald Trump in 2016. He had a sense, he instinctively grasped kind of what bothered the people, but it was less, a master plan that he consciously executed, but he had a feeling of this frustration. And I think this is something you see, and maybe just to add on one thing about this is broader than like in the Netherlands, just a matter of, let's say, environmental protection from nitrogen. Like people feel that they have been told in the past that migration is not going to be a problem, right? They have been told that that crime is not a problem, right? They have been told that inflation is never, ever going to be a problem again. They have been told that if they transition to green energy, it will create jobs and prosperity. It will be a smooth ride. And none of the things actually happened. I mean, we see this now also in other countries, for example, Germany, right? Where the country is preparing for massive outages in gas, depending on what Russia does, right? So there's still this big unknown. And I think this is an issue. And if you allow me one last part to my monologue, because this has been so important for me to say, is I think what we experience at the moment a little bit is that the nations that built the industrialized world, they have lost their stamina, right? Think about it in this way. In the United States, the average environmental impact study by the US government takes 5 years to be ready. Compare this to the building of the Golden Gate Bridge in the 1930s. That took 4 years. The Hoover Dam took 5 years. The Germans can no longer build an airport under 14 years. So there are things we simply can no longer do. Wow. And this is really, I think, the problem with an ideology. And I think that's what it is. This is an ideology, no matter how we look at it. Like, I love the environment too. I come from the Sound of Music country, right? So I want to protect the environment more than you can imagine. But at the moment, it seems we want to sacrifice the future to atone for the past. And I think this is a very dangerous recipe.
Right, and it's very telling who has to sacrifice always when it comes down to it, right? The elite policymakers and their consensus, it's always, well, we need to sacrifice, we're asking more of you. That's been very clear in the U.S. during the Ukraine-Russia crisis, where, now we have out of control gas prices, we have working people struggling to pay for gas, and what we hear from the elites and from the government is, well, it's necessary because it's for Ukraine and it's a war. And that might, if that's true, nobody voted for that. That wasn't told to any, like the people didn't give a mandate to the U.S. people didn't provide any mandate for a government to do that. But then you hear a government leader say things like, well, can't you just get a Tesla? Then you don't have to pay for gas at all. Which is totally, wildly out of the reach of most working people. So, and that, I think it's that disconnect between who is being asked to sacrifice, even if the elites are right, even if it is important to do things for the environment and so many other subjects. It feels like, well, okay, but you're asking a lot of us, and you've been wrong before, and it's hypocritical.
Yeah, right. Let me add on to this. There are ways how we could, I think, at least mitigate many of the problems when it comes to climate and environmental issues, but still not wreck the economy. Then there's nuclear energy, for example, not to the same amount everywhere, right? Some countries where there's a lot of sun, that have the right conditions, they can do a lot with, solar and wind. Other countries can't. Other countries have hydropower. So I think it really depends on, there will be different energy mixes for different countries. But as they get better in producing energy, at some point, and we tend to forget this, and we see this now at the pump in the United States, energy is wealth. You cannot have a middle class without affordable energy. And this is going to get worse in the future because what we see there are entire parts of the world, particularly in Africa, that have almost no access to energy. So that the demand for energy goes up, and we continue to pursue policies in the West that restrict energy development. Once again, I'm for renewables, but I'm also for nuclear. And of course, there will be areas where we also need fossil fuels. And what people sense is this about solving a problem? Or is it about, if you give me a more provocative statement, or is it about causing some pain, as a way of, as I said, to kind of have this almost ideological religious component. It strikes me as odd, right, that the most outspoken person in this whole debate, Greta Thunberg, right, comes out publicly against nuclear energy when supposedly, CO2 emissions and carbon emissions is her main concern. That makes only sense in the light of ideology, but not in saying, okay, here we have a problem, what can we do to solve it?
Well, Professor, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Anytime.
We'll have more Rising right after this.